Hello to those who have just joined. We'll be beginning tonight's webinar in 2 minutes. So thank you for your patience. Good evening, everyone. So nice of you to join us. My name is Dan Brooks. I'm Club Z's National Activism Officer. Welcome to Club Z's third Eye on Zion webinar. Today's webinar is Israel, Caught Between Humanism and Self-Preservation with Nico Black. Before we introduce our distinguished guests, I just wanted to make a few important announcements. Beginning March 4th is our teen crash course, which is a 4-session online course that prepares teens to confront Jew hatred on campus and connects them with Zionist teens across the country. Also, from February 23rd to March 7th, renowned author, attorney, and public diplomacy expert Ron Bar Yoshafat will be on a national speaking tour and has set aside time to speak with Club Z audiences in LA, the Bay Area, North Carolina, and New York. So please stay tuned for more details on that. And lastly, this webinar would not be possible without the support of our generous donors. If you would like to experience more of this type of programming, please consider supporting us at clubz.org. So on to tonight's topic. Even among some of Israel's supporters, we hear criticism that Israel isn't doing enough to protect innocent life, whether it's in Israel and its army, of course, operate under a code of ethics that it navigates as it defends its people from a relentless genocidal war. Here to talk with us about how Israel goes about this and how Israel's ethics gets lost in the storm of critique is Nico Black. Nico Black is an Israeli analyst, commentator, and advocate. Having spoken to and debated with diverse audiences, Nico brings a unique background to Israel advocacy. His mother is a founding member of B'Tselem, and his late father was The Guardian's Middle East editor. Nico was an IDF liaison to the Palestinian Authority and foreign journalist during the Second Intifada. Motivated to combat media bias, he offers a nuanced, measured, and analytical approach in explaining how the conflict is misrepresented in the media. So without further ado, I welcome Nico Black. Nico, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. Just as a point, I was never a journalist myself. That was a profession for my late father. I'd like to share a story. So my late father, he was the Middle East editor for The Guardian. I know we're in the United States, but The Guardian is right up there with the New York Times, Wall Street Journal type of publication. And my father and I grew up in Israel. My late father was English, and he worked for The Guardian. And we always had this discussion. We said, can there be peace? And the Israeli reflexive answer, which I held and I still hold, is I said it doesn't really matter what the world opinion says or what it is, because they're going to be anti-Semitic anyway. What does it matter? And my father would always say, my father had a PhD from Cambridge, and he wrote multiple books on the topic of the conflict, which says, yes, but the occupation has to end in order for us to pull back and identify the people that legitimately criticize the state of Israel, as opposed to ones that are just purely anti-Semitic. And so my father's no longer alive, and we actually arrived at that point of finding who is legitimately critical of the state of Israel, which can be critiqued like any country in the world, as opposed to the anti-Semites. And that didn't happen through reaching a two-state solution. That happened with the latest massacre, the horrible massacre that happened 4 months ago. And we really learned, we saw where that difference lays. We can see criticism of Israel or concerns regarding the actions of Israel from countries. This is not an ethical point, this is a practical material point, that are absolute allies to Israel. Germany is an ally to Israel. France is an ally to Israel. The United States is an ally to Israel. They have their different interests, but they're allies to us. They continue to supply us with weapons and with diplomatic coverage, and we're trading with them, right? And they have legitimate critiques. They might be misguided, but it's legitimate. Where it's not legitimate, and we see this, is South Africa's position, which is acting as a legal arm for Hamas, or the Palestinian Authority's perspective. And we can really see where the fault lines lay. And so I want to stop at that point and kind of explain how we reach at this point. Those of you who are attending this webinar, I suspect you're not that old, but there's been an evolution of how this conflict is spoken about, because you can imagine over the past 20 years and 30 years prior and 40 years prior, it's a conflict that's been going on for about 140 years, 150 years, right? And the perspectives through which it's been viewed, and the frames of reference through which it's been viewed, have obviously changed over time. And one of the largest things that kind of happened in my lifetime, I'm in my early 40s, is this whole thing of social media, which of course didn't exist 20 years ago. And that's changed things a lot and has brought to life all sorts of concepts that, we were thought were long and buried. Today, when you hear that Israel's a colonialist state, well, that's the kind of language that kind of ended in the early 90s when the Soviet Union collapsed. That was a good rhetorical point. And the Soviet Union was talking about them, saying, oh, we're supporting all these horrible third world country dictatorships because we're helping them decolonize. And, colonialism is a real thing. And a lot of countries correctly fought against colonialism. And also, of course, a byproduct of any decolonization project is a lot of violence, of which Israel isn't an exception. We, didn't decolonize per se, but through the process of the British mandate being lifted from mandatory Palestine, there was a lot of violence. We know this. There was violence against the British, there was violence of Arabs against the Jews, there was violence of Jews against the Arabs. So all these things kind of change over time. And so when I joined the army, and this was November 1999, my position was I was trained in Arabic. I speak Arabic quite badly now. It's been 2 decades now since I've used it on a daily basis, but I was trained in Arabic, and I was taught, as per the interests of the State of Israel, how to collaborate and work with the political entity called the Palestinian Authority, which is the governing body of 90% of Palestinians in Judea, Samaria, and Gaza, or the West Bank and Gaza. And it was in our interest to do that as a country, right? And we had, three types of interest there, and we still do, right? Which is we didn't want to have a resolution of the conflict in a way that would jeopardize the security interests of the State of Israel. We wanted to continue to expand Jewish presence or Israeli presence in Judea, Samaria, and at the time Gaza before we withdrew. And the third thing is we also needed to conduct ourselves according to certain standards of conduct, which is what Daniel was talking about, which is a certain ethical standard. Not just altruism, but also self-interest. Without the ability to have, a humanitarian edge, you're not as able to gather intelligence, or you're not as able to create a policy of divide and conquer, which all serves the national interests of the State of Israel as defined through its democratic government of electing parties to represent and form a coalition based off of how the majority of Israelis see the interests of the country. So this was the play, and having that humanitarian edge was certainly something that at the time of setting up the unit that I was in, and I'll talk about that in a second, it was important, and it had, served our self-interest. Because, for example, at the time, South Africa, that was a horrible racist regime and very brutal, they didn't have that, I'd say, softness or humane perspective on things, and ultimately that ended in a not a bloody revolution, but there was a change of power that was traumatic. And so it obviously serves Israel's interest to conduct itself in a more sophisticated way. And the racism wasn't there. Certainly nothing comparable to South Africa, and certainly wasn't a state policy. It was more predicated on security concerns. Not to say that there isn't racism, but it was never a government policy. It didn't exist. Certainly not since, I'd say, certainly not since the late 50s or mid-60s kind of thing. Bias, yes. Racism, no. So the unit that I was in, work with the Palestinian government, make sure that there is free flow of people and goods between the Palestinian-controlled areas and between the State of Israel, right? And so for my first year, after I was taught Arabic for 6 weeks, a month and a half, I was stationed in Jericho on the border between the Palestinian Authority, Israel, and Jordan. And a year after that, I was stationed in Gaza, on the border crossing with Gaza, called the Erez crossing. And basically, at the time that I was stationed there, and I was starting to work with my Palestinian colleagues, they were my, fellow office workers, so to speak, is when we had the peace accord. Ehud Barak tried to strike a peace accord, a final peace accord, between Barak and Yasser Arafat at the time, the Palestinian leader, who basically said no, and in order to extract himself from that, started what we call the Second Intifada. And so there I am at the ground. I'm in a checkpoint through which buses, pass through between the city of Jericho and the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, and buses pass through this checkpoint, and it's a power sharing scheme, and we get on the bus together, me and my Palestinian colleague, and we check passports, and of course the security people are the Israeli, the IDF, and we let people through. It's a humanitarian thing, of course. They have the right of passage between the places, and we shut down the checkpoint, and suddenly there's fire everywhere and rocks everywhere. We shut down the checkpoint, and there's Molotov cocktails being thrown at us by children. So the Palestinians, Arafat, whatever, sends an army of children to attack a military base. And there's many stories of that and on that. We were attacked by snipers, and we were attacked, all this kind of thing. And the soldier was killed next to me, like 100 meters from me. And then the following morning, his friend, an officer who was upset and paranoid, he was securing the perimeter, nearly shot me, because what happened was a young girl, about 13, tried to get off the bus because she thought there was a bathroom. And him, blinded by grief and paranoia and rage, nearly shot her. I realized the situation, and I put myself in between him and this little girl. And I said to him, she just wants to go to the bathroom, calm it, you're not thinking straight. And I'm 18, right? And he says, you don't know that? I said, I do know that. Look at her, calm down. And then, he hisses at me, just remember whose side you're on. And I said, I'm following orders for the Ministry of Defense. That's what my unit is doing. And this is the kind of example that, despite having a power sharing scheme, despite having the best intentions, despite having all these goodwill and provisions and training, things on the ground get very messy, because humans are fallible, Jews are fallible, and you have these kind of situations. When I was in Gaza, for example, there was a woman who was trying to get to a flight. She was immigrating from Gaza, I think, or visiting her daughter in the US or something. And she needs to catch a flight. So she's going from Gaza to Ben Gurion airport. And she needs a pass to allow her to leave, right? And she can't leave. Why can't she leave? Because we can't find the soldier to bring it down from the command center. Why? Where's the soldier? Where's the driver to take it down from the command center? Well, he's making out with his girlfriend in the synagogue. System isn't evil. System is fallible, and humans are fallible. And tragedies exist in any situation where you have an interface between a military and a civilian population. For example, there was a very nice gentleman who was a doctor from Gaza, and he had a pass to go from Gaza to work in Beersheba. He was a physician, doctor, and he actually was a Gazan, and he'd go to Israel to work. And in one of the many clashes with Hamas years after, a tank shot a shell, right? Because Hamas was probably firing from a high-rise building, and that shell killed like 4 of his daughters. And it's a tragedy. It's horrible, right? And you just have these kind of situations where it's this ugly conflation of Israel has the right to have interests and not to be nice, like any country pursues its own interests. And Israel tries to act in an ethical way, and it's self-serving, and it's also the right thing to do, and it's also the only way to do it, because it's a people's army. If you want to have a people's army, it needs to hit, enough of the common denominator, so people keep coming in. And we also have, international obligations, because the state of Israel has put itself in a situation that it is completely dependent on international trade and on the goodwill of the United States in the supply of armaments and diplomatic backing. We can't do whatever we want. And is that ideal for us? In a way that it is, in a way it isn't, because one day, and you guys know it, there's going to be a new generation in the Senate, or president or whatever, and they might not like us that much. Where are we going to get our fighter jets from? Where are we going to get our ammunition from in the case that it's a long war? Obama already held back on providing us helicopter missiles during one of our clashes with Hamas. Can Israel afford to have that dependency? Probably not. But on the flip side, because we do have that dependency, it stops us from going off the deep end. There's a lot of rhetoric, right, in the current Israeli government, talking about how, we should, in effect, have a policy of genocide or have a policy of mass deportation. It's not all the government, but it's elements of the government. Israel can't do that because we can't manufacture our own enough of our own weapons. So is that a negative or is that a positive? I'd say that's a positive. Does it come at a price? Yes, it comes at a price. Us being kind of stuck with the paradigms or the interests of another country that doesn't represent the citizens of Israel, how they have their own legitimate interests, puts us at a disadvantage. We can't do whatever we want. On the flip side, we have extremists, of course. Are there anything comparable to the Palestinian side? Absolutely not. The Palestinian national movement has deformed into something so completely grotesque. It's always been twisted, but what we've seen now with Hamas taking center stage, it's something so completely grotesque that at times like this, I wish that we had the independence to deal with them as we wished. Obviously not to commit genocide, but certainly not to have any consideration towards what a country like the US or France or whatever is thinking about, considering the enormity of the threat, right? So how am I doing on time, Danielle? I'd like to leave time for questions and all that kind of stuff. I'm okay. All right, another 5. One of the interesting pieces that exists, and I think that this is important to stress, is that there's a bit of sociological, I wouldn't say reversal, but there's a confusion in which a lot of people say, forget about the world, they're just anti-Semitic, right? There's a truth to that. Or alternatively, we have to just think about the world because who are we? We're pipsqueaks. And there's an element of that, but that's not the whole story. The fact of the matter is that Judaism, as opposed to Christianity that had its Enlightenment period, right? The medieval period, the Enlightenment period, and then stemming from that humanism. Humanism was always core to Judaism. The Torah speaks about it. It's very central. Conducts of ethics. Yeah, that's okay. Conducts of ethics. It's not to say that Jews are incapable of committing terrible acts. Of course, we are. We are human. We are fallible. But when you look at where the cultures are, when you look at Jewish culture, from a value perspective, it's not that dissimilar to Christian culture over the past 300 years. The problem with Islamists, meaning that they want to politicize Islam, is that Islam in its own right never had that point of humanism. It just never developed to that level. And it doesn't really matter because, Islamists in some societies, they're 5%, and in some societies they're up to 60%, like it appears to be with the Palestinians. So it doesn't really matter. But Israel doesn't need the international system to intrinsically have a healthy, organic debate about acting ethically, because it is built into the structure of our society. Not to say that we're incapable of doing things. We know that during the War of 48 there were massacres. We're aware of this, but that's people in general. The question is it frowned upon or is it celebrated? And we know that it's frowned upon. And so when we're talking about the IDF moral code, it's not just there for whitewashing things. It is something that's demanded, required upon by the general populace. To say nothing of the fact that, of course, that Israel and the IDF don't just include Jews; they include Christians and Muslims. Happily, there's been an uptick in Muslims in the military. Christians certainly, and the Jews, of course. So by having this kind of humanistic underbelly for us, above anything else, from a self-serving perspective, it has allowed us to be effective at preserving the army, maintaining military excellence, and also weakening our enemies, because at the end of the day, they require that cancer treatment. They require that pass. They need that job permit. And so obviously self-preservation is the number one thing that we have to do. But where do you draw the line, right? Is self-preservation having all of Israel? Is self-preservation having Sinai, for example? If we had Sinai still, which would increase the size of Israel fivefold, maybe we wouldn't have to worry so much about what the United States thought, because we actually would be a significantly more distributed population, and we wouldn't be so vulnerable. So here's a question. Can you tell us about the IDF moral code? Do all armies have this code? Sorry, let me read this out. Actually, looks like I can answer live.
Yeah, no problem.
All right, answer. No, I'll just attend to it. Can you tell us about the IDF moral code? Do all armies have this code? When does it put us in tension between achieving our military goals and being ethical human beings? All right. Let me answer that in a bit. Although it broke my trail of thoughts, let me answer it now instead. So the IDF moral code is, gosh, if I remember it from my training, it's basically you're not supposed to do anything unless you're supposed to do whatever your commander tells you, unless there's either a red or a black flag waved that you can wave upon that order. So an order that you just shouldn't do. If somebody's not a threat to you, you're not supposed to shoot them. Other armies have similar things. I think Western armies actually enforce them. I'm not familiar with all of them. I do know that they exist, not to the extent that ours does. And part of that is kind of sad because, it's because we have so much interface with civilian populations, it really highlights that point. But most armies, I think, stick to the Geneva Convention, honestly. When does it put us in tension between achieving our military goals and being ethical human beings? It puts us at tension all the time. It puts us tension all the time. It's always, look, it's an obstacle, right? As we say, it's fighting one with one hand behind your back, right? But at the same time, if you don't do that, then you're going to start losing elements of the army. And the state of Israel can't stand on its own legs, really, because we're dependent on importing our weapons and on trade. We're not a self-sufficient country like the United States. Few are. Yeah, sure. Well, tell more of my story, I guess. So yeah, so I think the last bit I told you of the story was with the poor doctor, and he's since immigrated to Canada. You can catch interviews with the guy occasionally. Very sad. Yeah, the guy didn't deserve it, obviously. Most citizens killed in action don't deserve it, right? So that's tragic, obviously. We had another guy when I was in Erez, and what he did he used to ferry suitcases from one side of the border crossing to another. Said was his name, and Said he had this great gig. He had a monopoly, had this little cart, and he'd ferry the suitcases from here to here, and he'd collect 5 shekels a pop. Until one day, we were drinking coffee during a shift, and rocket crashes down and knocks Said off his feet. He's fine, but they destroyed his trolley. And so then, because it's not so simple, you need to have the Secret Service approve the Shabak, approve the trolley again. And so he was out of work for a month. You have all these kind of situations. You've got Said, who saved all of our lives also. Like I said, he was just he'd ferry the suitcases. One day, Said goes to the chemical toilets that are there for everybody as they pass through the checkpoint leading out from Gaza. And Said, we suddenly see him, and he's as white as a sheet. And he's walking towards us, and he's got an M16, quite an automatic assault rifle. But how is he holding it? He's holding it like this, on the palms of his hand. So it's, parallel to him. And he's shouting, "Help, help." What's going on? So one of our new soldiers that joined the unit, he'd take a dump, goes to the bathroom, forgets his M16. Said, and just leaves it there, right? Said goes, needs to relieve himself, whatever, walks in, sees an M16, chemical toilets. And he's thinking to himself, okay, if I leave it here and somebody else wants to do a terrorist attack, there's a rifle here with a clip in it. I can't have a terrorist attack. I don't want these, I don't want anyone to be hurt. This guy's a Gazan, right? Said is the Gazan guy, right? On the flip side, if I carry it out, the soldiers are going to see me and they're going to shoot me. And this guy, he's got family, he's got kids, all that kind of stuff. What I do? So he walks out on the palms of his hands, says, "Help, we have a situation." The army isn't evil. It has stupid people in it, or stupid procedures, or badly thought out procedures. And you see that all the time. And fundamentally, we're dealing with, it's hard to say who and what the Palestinians are. Well, all we can do is we can look at their leadership. And we have a leadership that's refusing to accept statehood because it thinks it's got a better play at hand, which appears to be either to line their pockets in the case of the Palestinian Authority, or to eventually eliminate the state of Israel. And I can tell you that the Palestinian population has been radicalized. When I was a child, and I'd go with my mother, who was a human rights activist, my father, we had friends in Bethlehem, Palestinians. It was quite peaceful. Obviously, there were riots and stuff like that occasionally, whatever. But Islam wasn't a big deal. They were kind of like secular Jews. And things weren't that big of deals, the 80s. And there was a lot of friendship between Palestinians in Judea, Samaria, and Israel, because there was no wall. And we controlled the textbooks. And there were friendships, and not just me and my parents, but a lot of people. And they'd go to the beach in Tel Aviv on the weekend. And since The project, the two-state project, actually started taking place with the Palestinian Authority and controlling the textbooks, and then creating a separation, and the populations weren't as mobile, which once again served the interests of the State of Israel. It created complete alienation between the different populations. And that made our soldiers, I think, I don't know, say worse, but you knew a lot fewer Palestinians, and you knew fewer Arabs. But it's certainly on their side, it was very there's a lot of demonization that allowed to set roots. And so you meet Palestinians today, and they're a few years older than me, speak fluent Hebrew, hate the government, don't hate the Jews. Hate some Jews, sure. Why wouldn't you? They have suffered, absolutely. But they're very nostalgic, and they miss how it used to be. And that's one of the things. The State of Israel didn't want to control the Palestinians. They didn't want to pay the price, the financial price even, right? Or the policing price. And the State of Israel, bloomed financially through the peace deals with Jordan. It opened up a lot of foreign investment. We used to be a socialist country, a fairly poor socialist country, and we became a wealthy capitalist country. But we're also paying a price for it, because the cost of letting go of the control of the Palestinians and crowning upon them the PLO, and then inadvertently crowning upon them Hamas, even though they had a violent takeover of the Gaza Strip in 2007. We brought this upon ourselves. We pursued our national interests. So it's complicated. This is a good stopping point.
But let's continue with the Q&A. I think there's going to be, I'm already seeing some questions that you can't see. I'm getting like personally driven questions sent to me. Speaking on the PA, I have one question. As your role as a liaison to the PA, were there any times that there was real talk between you and whoever you were liaising with in terms of, the conflict, any kind of like, times where you heard, look, we're going to win this war, they're telling you, or we're in, Zionism is not going to last, or Israel's not going to last, or anything like that? And conversely, was there any points of optimism where even officials in the PA would indicate some sort of note of moderation?
So it's an interesting question. It's a good question. And I think that you're asking if we had an honest conversation.
Right.
Basically, right? It depends on how you answer, right? So they start with me and say, oh, where's your family from? And I would say, well, where's your family from? Are they Egyptian? Are they Iraqi? Are they Syrian? Are they Saudis? And they're like, oh, 1 second. And, I've got a little trump card. And I said, my family, part of my family, arrived in 1914 for the Balfour Declaration. When did your family arrive? And then they'll say, oh, my family's always been. I say, yeah, but not all of you, is it? And because if you know the history, you can answer that and say you're doing parity. And so then they're a lot more open, because otherwise they're pushing the party line, which is, all you guys came here, colonial, European nonsense. And look, that's just me. I mean, look at me. I'm as white as the shade of the moon, right? So that's that. If you're a bit darker, I'm not sure what those conversations would look like.
Right.
Optimism? No, I'm not optimistic. And I will tell you why. I'm not optimistic because their national narrative, like ours, that can be simple and kind of self-aggrandizing and all this kind of stuff, although that's my camp, I'm on that side, I'm a proud Zionist. Their national narrative 100% conflicts with ours. It's a zero-sum game. Zionism isn't a zero-sum game. We can carve up land, it's not an issue. Theirs is a zero-sum game. There are Palestinians that just want to live. That is a population, that is a shrinking population that it looks like. It was a lot better years ago. Now I
And
doubt
that
you'll
they're
find.
moving to the West. Those
What's
moderates are
that?
shrinking in that those moderate Palestinians are moving to the West. Is that why they're shrinking? Or just simply the population is growing?
No, I would argue that you will not find moderate Palestinians in the West. You will find moderate Palestinians in Judea and Samaria and Gaza because they actually understand the price of this conflict. The most radicalized Palestinians that I've encountered don't live in Western countries.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Another question. Actually about the PA, because you had said something earlier in reference to dealing, if Israel could deal on its own with the PA without the pressures of the international community, how would it deal with them? Of course, it would be in a humanitarian way, but would it be to completely defang them? Would it be to go revert back to pre-Oslo and empower more local leadership? What is, let's say the world, the global pressure on Israel dissipated overnight, hypothetically, what would Israel be doing?
I think, well, what Israel would do, which is what most, Western governments would do, is like, what are the formal obligations that exist contractually between the two parties that were negotiated? And it would map all the breaches, of which there's many on both sides, and try to stick to that. The fact of the matter is that, the founding charter of the Palestinian Authority is the Oslo Accords, and both sides basically stopped following much of it in the late 90s. So I think that that's what we would do. We're just turning a blind eye because we don't know what we want to be when we grow up, to be perfectly honest. And that certainly reflects how things have been managed the past 15 years on the Israeli side.
So we have a question from someone who has heard your story before, asking if you can share, and I'm sorry if you alluded to it earlier, share the story of you realizing that your peer in Gaza would kill you if given orders to.
Oh gosh, I don't even remember if it was Gaza, but certainly if it was Gaza
Sounds like
or
you're
not.
recollecting something.
Yeah, I mean, I'm recollecting multiple instances. Um, the relationship between us, and we work with these people on a day-to-day basis, was purely perfunctory. I think that's the word. I think that you find that the way that we think is, we're individual. What's the best play for us? What can we do? What's the correct thing? Weighing the pros and cons. The way that it worked, at least the Palestinian Authority, is you need to show your fealty, your loyalty, because it's not, you never act alone. Everything is predicated on your standing and your family's standing in the context of the relationship that you have with somebody else. So you never can act as an individual because it's what affects your family and the extended family also. You can't bring shame. You need to be part of a collective, which is the broader family. Specifically, there's an important sociological point that throughout the Levant and parts of Iraq, the family unit is very strong, extremely strong. And part of that accounts for the great degree of instability that exists in that specific area of the Middle East. In Egypt, you don't have that because they underwent urbanization. The family structure got broken apart. In places where there wasn't like that kind of stuff, each family is like a small army. And if you don't have force and weapons, or if one of the women of your family has an affair or something like that, you need to kill her because otherwise it shows that you're not in control of your own tribe. And so a one-to-one relationship can exist. Absolutely, it can exist. But everything is predicated on the interests of the larger family. It's a very foreign concept to us.
Right. actually, on that note about explaining foreign concepts to Western audiences that might not understand them, how does, and this is a loaded question, how does Israel go about exposing, some of these aspects of Islamic honor shame culture, specifically, using children as martyrs and things like that? Is this a team effort? Is this not Israel alone? Does it come down to Zionists and the diaspora? How do we leverage media, and to what, and this is a more loaded question, to what extent or to what limit do we have doing that? Because it is still fashionable to hate Jews anyway, but how can we make some progress there?
When I have these kind of debates, my day job is a marketer. I'm in high tech, right? And so what you try to do is you try to find a heuristic to work with. And so you say something that shocks people. You say, do you know that female genital mutilation happens to 90% of women throughout the Middle East? And most people don't know that. And so that gives you a wedge to say, things aren't as you expect them to be. And that's where you lead. And fundamentally, what my message is, listen, guys, and you say this explicitly. I want to be there is no racism. Race is incorrect. Being racist is disgusting and degrading. But some cultures are superior to others. And do you know how we know? Because in cultures that are superior to others, we don't mutilate women's genitals. Part of the conflict that we have, Israel with the Palestinians, is a very deeply seated cultural conflict. And I can say 100% that we're dealing with an inferior culture. Let me explain why, because that's provocative. And then you can go into it. You need to lead with controversy, but nothing that you can refute. And that's very important. It's the only way in my opinion. Because once people doubt what they think that they know as their understanding of the situation, it gives you an opening to go into that.
Right. Strategically, do you think it is better, or does it hurt our cause to make Nazi comparisons? Sorry for the noise. To make Nazi comparisons to Palestinian society and their government and their way of life, or does it totally depend on context?
I always need coffee.
Because you've gotten the question before, or
no? Masha says I need coffee. I always need coffee. So it's a really good question. I haven't thought about it before. My gut tells me that it hurts our cause, because Jews have been harping on about the Holocaust forever. It doesn't feel authentic. That's how I'm taking it.
I would just say, some would say, and I have these conversations too, I'm in sort of the field of Holocaust education, that we don't harp on it enough, or we don't bring it up, or we're too PC, let's say, to bring it up in certain instances. So I guess it depends who you ask. Depends
sure.
what you're talking to.
I mean, I think, language creates reality is what they say. And I think that it is sufficiently effective to say, look, Hamas didn't launch a military operation against us. They sent in death squads. That's perfectly effective. I think that going back to the Holocaust, you can make a mention. You can say, if you think that Israel's overreacting, it's because we didn't have an army in the past, and now we do. And this is how you deal with an enemy that sends in death squads with marching orders to exterminate children, etc., etc. It doesn't have to be the main point. It can be a supporting component.
That could be a response to questioning Israel's military objectives or practices. What about the politics? And talking about the two-state solution, how do we explain to people, and how do we try to get it through to our government, that pressuring Israel to negotiate with Nazi-like entities is ultimately counterproductive? Maybe there we could have some traction. No? Or is it just too far of a bridge, you're suggesting?
I think that the PC thing to say is, of course, everyone who wants self-determination is entitled to self-determination. What that means specifically is something that we need to be very precise about. Considering the current policies of the different Palestinian parties, one thing is absolutely clear: that state cannot have an army, just like Luxembourg. That state has to have a very controlled educational system, just like Germany did after World War II. Absolutely, of course they deserve a state. Of course they deserve a state. What are the conditions, considering such poor choices that their unelected leadership has made for decades? That's what we should talk about.
Would you think Palestinians would even and go into that bluff of, let's say they wanted to just have a state just to fool the world, and when they have the state, they could gradually either build up an army or engage in small, militant tactics, or the hatred against Israel is so much that they wouldn't even indulge in that fantasy.
I mean, every single bit of progress that the Palestinians have made was because of concessions that the state of Israel has done. Partially under duress, but partially as in the incorrect assumption that it's going to serve us. It looks like this has led us to a complete dead end. And so I would be very surprised. I mean, the current Israeli government are a complete disgrace, and have conducted themselves appallingly. I would be surprised that any patriotic government, which we do not currently have, would make any concessions towards the Palestinians for the next few decades. But it's not to say that Bibi won't sell us out.
I have another question here about the U.S. relationship you had alluded to earlier, and I think you were suggesting that it might be difficult for Israel to move away. And I think, as you may know, recently there's been a lot of ink spilled about how can we move away and wean ourselves off, because ultimately connecting ourselves so tightly with the United States might be hampering our policies, or Israel's policies. Do you agree with that?
Well, I don't want to be dependent on anyone, and as Ben Gurion said, David Ben Gurion said, doesn't matter what the Goyim say, it's what the Jews will do. And I agree with that. There is no substitution for the United States. Doesn't mean that in tandem we can't act more responsibly and bolster our own, military industry and be more strategic about what we do, and not just to be, dependent on export, and to have a better functioning government and increase efficiency and reduce fat and, act with some more urgency. The US, there's no substitution for the US. There won't be. We'll never have an ally like the US. But it doesn't mean that we need to trust the US blindly. We need to have a mutually beneficial relationship. I definitely think that we need to sever the US giving Israel any military aid. I think that is poisoning the relationship, and we're now a wealthy country and we don't need that anymore. We should be able to pay fair market prices for what the US has got to offer.
All right. Before we wrap up, no more questions in the Q&A, but I had a question because I deal a lot with activism, and we have a big community here that is constantly struggling to make Israel's case and to make the case against its enemies. So, what sort of parting wisdom would you give to activists, whether it's, social media or generically, about what do we focus on the most? Or is it sort of evenly distributed between, one, Israel's humanitarianism and its moral codes versus, the lack of moral codes of our enemies? How do we even go about explaining what Israel faces? And sort of, do we put a focus on one thing over another?
So I don't think that anyone believes Israel's moral code. I think that for a broad audience, it's like, it doesn't seem believable considering the counter narrative. So for me as a marketer, this is a controversial perspective. I understand that, but it's to completely shock people into picking a different paradigm. And the paradigm is the indigenous paradigm, which is fundamentally what we're dealing with is a colonial reaction, a colonial force that has been beaten down, which is the Arab colonial project, which has been shrinking and shrinking and shrinking over the years. And the Jews, like the Maronites, like the Yazidis, like the Berbers, are the indigenous people of the Middle East. And we are dealing with a failed imperialistic thrust coming out of Saudi Arabia. And that's why there hasn't been any compromise. And that's why that's why we're fighting an anti-colonial battle. And that's what we're doing. And when we're talking about Palestinians and that they're indigenous, no, they're not. 80% of them arrived to get work when our immigration restrictions were lifted because of the weakening of the Ottoman Empire. Jews weren't allowed to buy land. Christians weren't allowed to buy land. It's only because the Ottoman Empire lost the independence war with Greece in the mid-19th century. So then they started flocking there. They colonized the land. And
Right.
2 decades before that, Ali Pasha from Egypt, he also colonized everything when he led his revolt against the Ottoman Empire. All of Gaza are Egyptians. And those that were refugees from Israel, most of them, they came from other places, Iraq, Syria, whatever. We're indigenous. They're trying to push us out. We're not going to let them.
Right. So I love that. As best we can, we need to take these terms, these buzz terms that are being wielded so casually, and shine the truth on them, because ultimately, the truth benefits us.
It's a simplistic argument, and it has a flair of the fantastical to it, but it's a very reasonable way to read the facts, and it shocks the audience in saying, 1 second, we thought the Earth was flat. It's actually something else. And that's what you need, in my opinion.
Well, we're at 9 o'clock. Thank you so much, Nico, for sharing your some of your history, your insights, your wisdom. Before I do a wrap up, do you have anything, any parting words, or anything that you'd like to promote?
No, I just want to thank all of you guys, and if you guys do actually do the work of the advocacy, you know, we're the old ones in this story. We're the ancient people in this story. We have the deep historical perspective. That is a foreign concept for most people. And so it's kind of upon us to show a different way of looking at reality without being apologetic. And understanding that Judaism is a civilization. We have different values, different morals, and so be proud about that, and let that be kind of a light for you.
Oh,
So,
thank you. That's beautiful, and very much what Club Z is also about. So thank you for your time. Before we say goodnight, just wanted to do a couple of reminders. Again, beginning on March 4th is Club Z's Teen Crash Course, the 4-session online course that preps teens to confront Jew hatred on campus and connects them with Zionist teens across the country. And again, February 23rd through March 7, we have Ron Bar Yoshafat, an author, attorney, and diplomacy expert, who will be on a national speaking tour and will speak to Club Z audiences. So stay tuned for more details there. And then lastly, this webinar series would not be possible without the support of our generous donors. If you would like to experience more of this type of programming, please consider supporting us at clubz.org. And lastly, our next webinar will be at the end of the month. It will likely be the 21st, and we will let you know the speaker and other details as we get them. So thank you again, Nico. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and be well, and good luck with all that you do with on behalf of Israel. It's very much appreciated. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Nico. Hi, Basha.